All right, this is it. Welcome to the Inhuman Condition podcast. This is going to be the first episode. We've pre-recorded a handful of them, and we're going to start releasing them soon, but we wanted to kind of do a quick, hopefully not too scripted intro to kind of tell you guys a little bit about ourselves and about what the series is about. So without any further ado, Mike, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So, as he already introduced me, I'm Mike. I would say fortunately / unfortunately, I tend to kind of have a worldview that's more instinctually from a psychological perspective. It ultimately led me into a career of psychotherapy. So if that gives you some idea of how we'll be talking here. I'm 35 years old. I'm married. I have 2 children. That whole part of my life has definitely influenced my worldview. Socially, politically, I kind of tend to be the annoying guy in the room where I'm pretty centrist, and oftentimes I'll play devil's advocate, even if I agree with you, just because I really like to, I don't know, have this thing with bias, I guess, make people aware of another perspective or even empathize with the other's perspective. In my free time, I really have a car obsession. It's problematic. It's a big time waster. I like to exercise pretty regularly. I like to be healthy, some for health, some for, let's be honest, a little bit of vanity. I also like to hang out with my kids a lot. I like to reduce their self-esteem, which I know is pretty contrary to what the rest of you are probably trying to do with your kids, by beating them in games. Of course, I'm kidding, but I think it's fun to watch them squirm as I'm destroying them in Mario Kart or Horse or whatever we're playing around with. What about you, Jordan?
Yeah, so I guess I view myself as a technologist, whatever you think that means. I'm married, 33 years old, so much younger than Mike. I'm a digital product manager, but I have a focus in media, so that's really my background, and education, which is in journalism. That was kind of the path I was originally headed down right out of high school, but as a lot of people find, fell into another career along the way, so I had lucked out and gotten a job at a major car magazine, but then sort of fell into a role maintaining and building out new features on their website kind of in the early days, and then the rest is history from there. So I'm from Michigan originally, and that's where Mike and I met, but I now live in the San Francisco Bay Area and kind of unfortunately embody all the stereotypes that come along with that. But other than that, I've got way too many hobbies. As Mike mentions, also have an obsession with all things automotive, which you guys will find that we can't help but work into our episodes periodically because we're always car shopping and arguing about cars. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what the Inhuman Condition is really all about.
Yeah, sure. So during our lifetimes, we've obviously watched technology work its way into all facets of our lives. I would say that we're currently codependent on many of the technologies we use. There's clearly advantages. I think that's the easier part to recognize of the technology. But I would say it's ultimately changed the way that we're human. And that's not always for better. I do think, well, as you'll probably recognize in the way that I speak, sometimes I believe it's for worse. So Jordan and I have had these debates / conversations / arguments about these topics anyway. If you go through our text logs on our phones, I mean, you pretty much see the outlines for everything that we've been talking about kind of naturally unfolding. So we decided it could be interesting if we have a little exercise of recording these things and putting them into a podcast.
Right. So, I mean, if I literally just read from our series description to kind of frame things up as concisely as possible, we, as humanity, are faster and more connected than ever before, but despite all of the advancements making our lives easier, something still feels off. We're more emotionally distressed, divided, and increasingly hostile towards one another. But why? During each episode, we're going to try to examine the difficulties experienced by modern society and why we believe we struggle with them. So some of the topics that we're going to touch on throughout, the ones that we've already pre-recorded, just to kind of further frame things up. Some are more technology-based, others are more psychology-based, and sort of obviously the tie-in is two-sided, but some of the topics include autonomy, kind of the robotification of cars or manufacturing and our way of life and how we're dealing with that. Smartphones, how they've worked their way into every part of our lives and how we can't put them down. Telepresence, the pros and cons of working and interacting with other humans remotely, which a lot of us are dealing with right now in quarantine. Outrage culture, why do we think that our opinions are important? Why do we have to get outraged about things? Why do we have to make those opinions public on social media? Debt products are another one that we talk through about our society's need to live outside their means, maybe, and the predatory products that are designed with that in mind. So this is kind of just a synopsis of some of the things we're going to touch on, and there's a lot more to come. Today we're going to talk about identity. Could you kind of give a quick run through of what that's about, Mike?
Yeah, sure. So the idea was to talk about identity because it seems like everyone is, has their bumper sticker identity, and they're carrying it around with themselves all the time, and they're just really clinging to it. So whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, using your political affiliation or your political party or your political views or your sexual orientation or your career label, we have social media profiles, LinkedIn profiles that are expected for us to label our identity on there. Who are you? How do you feel? Whatever label you want to add to it. And we also have a tendency to diagnose everything. Everyone's got a tendency to gravitate towards some sort of medical condition one way or another. So why do we do it? What are the benefits and limitations? And do you identify with anything? And is it important to you that other people share the same or have the same opinion about your identity as you do? So we hope you enjoy these episodes and you guys get something useful out of them. Be sure to check back because we do release them every Sunday. So I hope you enjoy listening.
And I just want to add to that, because we're not good about remembering to say this during the episodes. If you're interested in reaching out, we set up an email address and a Twitter account. So if you want to email us, it's just inhumanpod@gmail.com. And if you want to tweet at us and have it, ignore it, at inhumanpod on Twitter, we'll not get you a response. So just kidding. But we'll periodically post things there. And give it a listen. Thanks.
Man, this kind of leads into our topic, yeah? So identity, right? Our topic of identity, right? So you're talking about, like, obviously people want to have a certain status there. They may identify with these things. They have these vehicles. There's my impressions of what, a San Francisco identity was a long time ago. But
I want to hear what that is.
Well, it was like it's a place where you go and whatever. It's like, when I think of it, it's like, old hippie movements, it's progressive thinking or whatever, it's like relaxed. Yeah. And now it seems tightly wound, but yeah, I don't know. It seems like we're all doing that all the time, right? Like we're all having to demonstrate what we think about, what we are. We want other people to think about us a certain way. We get frustrated if they have a different idea of, what our identity is. Versus like what we think we identify with. How do you find yourself over there?
I guess my first question is how do you describe identity?
Tough. I guess when I think of identity, it's almost like when you think of yourself, if you like think of yourself as resume, right? From perhaps from inside and outside, right? Like you have an outside line item. So that would be perhaps your facade. So how you look, right? And then, through the way to the inside. So there's like how you look on the outside. That might be how you style yourself. If you exercise, how you do your hair, how you carry yourself.
I like how you said, if you exercise and referring to me.
Or not, or not, or not, through to the inside, or like intellect or ideas that you may have, right? What do you believe in? Do you identify with, or, I guess, yeah. Do you have certain beliefs that you hold, religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, superstitions, perhaps? Are there groups that you internally feel connected to? And I think oftentimes it is, I mentioned being connected to. I think the outer layer through the inner layer, the identity is like, what kind of label can I put in all of these different categories to find myself in a place with another group, right? And perhaps that's the first, or maybe that's the more infantile version of it, or the earlier version of it, where seeking identity means like, where do I belong, versus like understanding what I am or deciding to be what I am. So does that make sense as my definition
Yeah,
for?
I mean, I guess it's just sort of like, so is it? But is it like your the collection of those things, or is it each of those things? Because I feel like I identify, like I have this idea of who I am, the culmination of all the boxes that I check. But then there's also certain sort of personas or like categories within that, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting thing that you're pointing out, because perhaps sometimes some areas of our whatever quote unquote identity are emphasized over others, dependent on like what environment we're in. You know what I mean? It's like you could be around some people and you pull out this part of your identity more. You may carry this label or represent yourself as this label more than other labels. Maybe you're doing it consciously. Maybe you're not, conscious at all there.
Oh, I would say for sure I'm doing it consciously, and it's something that bothers me, like when I'm doing it,
Mm, like you're
But I
aware of it.
think
Yeah.
I'm aware of it, but I think like I don't know. I don't know if that's wrong, and maybe we can get to that. Like if you like you when you put on airs, so to speak, right? Like
Mm,
I'm a different person with you than I am with my boss. I'm a different person with the mailman than I am with a clerk at a store. Like it's just like it's like the context of this situation makes you take on a persona or like apply filters maybe that you wouldn't normally. If that makes sense, or it does
sure.
me.
You think you're worried about
Um,
consequence, or what is the reason to alter that? Or not alter that, but perhaps emphasize one area and whatever, diminish another area.
well, so I guess in like using those examples, I guess I would say, to your boss, yeah, it's consequence, but it's also like filtering out the unnecessary, right? Like I'm going to have a conversation with you and you're responsible for like my livelihood. I might cut out the unnecessary. I recognize the value in your time. I recognize that you just need like sort of objective information from me about how to make a decision. And so maybe I'm focused on um, being curt and getting you what you need and getting you on your way versus like with a friend where it's like I think we're friends because we want that sort of subjective touch and we want to talk about the things that we're interested in, blah 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 blah, and so like that affects something that I would say to you that I wouldn't say to him being my boss. So I guess that's one example. And then yeah, I think there are other examples where it's like you're trying to impress somebody or uh, put emphasis, on a given trait, right? Like it's not that I think I become somebody I'm not, but I think that when you're talking to somebody who maybe you deem as like an intellectual, you're speaking to them in a way that you wouldn't necessarily speak to a 5-year-old, right?
Sure.
And is that dishonest, or is that just the context of your interaction?
Do you feel like you lose your identity though in there? You know what I'm saying? Or you're just emphasizing certain things? I think well, obviously, I have my own blind spots to this, right? I have my own biases as I think about it. I feel like when I go somewhere, I'm always the same person, right? I'm always the same identity. I'm trying to emphasize things. I'm trying to articulate things. I'm trying to demonstrate myself in a way where it's consistent. Obviously, there are areas where I feel like there may be some things that I would say or some behaviors that I might exhibit that I would uh, perhaps minimize because I don't feel like they would be appropriate to the environment. But I don't think that they would be incongruent with whatever I identify with, right? Whatever like labels mean something to me, right? So I don't know. I guess I'm wondering, yeah, would you feel like you're like the 5-year-old, the person that is you that's talking to the 5-year-old would not be recognizable to the boss that you talk to?
Mm. No, I mean, I guess it's interesting. In certain cases, yes, right? Like I see what you're saying, that you're sort of separating like the filter that you apply from like a change in sort of like whatever the objective underlying like content is of the stuff I'm saying. So it's like if I'm talking to the 5-year-old, maybe I'm not getting into like the nuances of like my thought process or something like I would with you, but I'm I'm losing my train of thought on that. But I'm not changing the output, I guess. But in certain cases, I feel like I am. And I guess a good case is like somewhere where maybe you disagree with somebody, like fundamentally, right? So, like, I had this guy come do a permit inspection at my house Friday, like the county guy who signs off on, electrical work. And I don't know how we even got on. I think we were talking about, he was saying he was doing solar panel inspections or something. And we sort of got off on this tangent, and he was saying how like, oh, this is all bullshit anyways, because like the electric power that's generated, that will power your electric car in the case of like people who are um, trying to like get off the grid and use these batteries to store power, or even like the solar panels that are built at a factory that's powered by coal powered plants. Like that was his whole point.
Sure.
And he was sort of, it was like, chances are blah 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 blah, this energy is made down the street in a coal burning plant, and blah blah blah. And it's like there were nuances to it, and I just didn't feel like having the argument. And so I think I just sort of caved into it. I was like, yeah, I guess like it's not perfect yet, and we have a long ways to go before there's like sustainable energy for everybody. But it was just one of those cases where it's like I didn't push it, because what was the point, right? It's like arguing with a guy on my porch. There was no
There's no outcome
there.
for it. Yeah, right. Okay.
So I think like in that case, then that's a simple one, and I'm sure there are more complex ones, but I just conceded to it because it's like, oh, who cares, right?
You think there's ever a benefit to like identities that you carry? Like there's definitely things like I don't know. I can state things that just off the top of my head, right, that I can identify with, right? So I would identify as like, oh, I'm into cars or something like that, and it's like, oh, I'm into these specific cars because whatever I've decided about them, right? Whatever I think they represent me. Or like, oh, I exercise or whatever it is, or like, oh, I know how to do these parts of exercise, or I work in this position or that position, okay. So I guess like here's the labels that I carry, like full without being vague about them, right? So I'm into cars. I'm into a very specific set of cars. It's mostly BMWs and Porsches / Porsches, if you're that kind of guy listening.
That's you mean the person who pronounces it correctly? Yeah.
I mean, depending on where you're at, sure.
Earth.
I watch a lot of British, British English speaking automotive, whatever shows. So therefore I call it a Porsche. Anyway, yeah, but those are like, at times I may identify as a psychologist because that's what I do, or I do psychotherapy, or even within there, depending on which psychotherapist I'm speaking with, it may even have subcategories. Oh, I'm a psychodynamic I know this is all jargon probably to most people, but a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So there are all these little categories that I identify with, and it's like, yeah, what is the benefit of it? Sometimes, I think about that. Like, am I holding myself together, or are we holding ourselves together with that, or do we think it's helping someone else hold on to us and like hold us together, or do we imagine that there's going to be some sort of gain for them? Do we hold on to these things that we care about because there's I don't know, grandiosity? So I don't know what it's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
I guess in those cases, like, is some of the, I see there as like a division between some of these as being sort of something that's objective, right? Like, yeah, you identify as a psychotherapist, but you are, right?
Sure.
So you would, right? Why wouldn't you? I guess other than if you're putting yourself in that arbitrary group, does that it's arbitrary, but it is a thing that I don't think you can't really like. I guess you can change it. I'm just thinking versus like a political alignment, right? Like if you're conservative versus liberal, that's something that can change over time. There's a spectrum there versus like you are a psychotherapist. You can't unbe that. If that makes sense.
Yeah. But do you hold that like on the front layer of your identity? Like when I walk into a room and I introduce myself, do I say, hello, I'm Mike. I'm Michael, and I'm a psychotherapist, like how some people, they'll introduce them, or even if they ask questions, amongst, upon their introduction to you, like, hey, how are, they address you and they ask you, like what you do, or, whatever, what are you interested in? Some of those things, it's like, it gives you a glimpse, I feel, into what things they hold perhaps most important into how they identify with themselves. So they have that similar projection and they're projecting it onto you when they're asking their questions. But yeah, I get what you mean. Some of it is like just fact, right? Like I do this, therefore that part can be a label that I have in a very fact way. So I'm a psychotherapist because that's what I do. But do I identify with that? I guess I don't feel like that all the time. Sometimes it is something I just feel like I do, and I have a certain thought process. But maybe it's not always on the forefront of. I guess like if I was walking around and I felt like there was a resume on me. I don't know if it's the top line item on my resume.
Yeah, I guess I think some people are much more transparent in that way. I think that they identify or like fit into sort of a set of personas, and but I also think we all think that we're these unique butterflies. Like I
Sure.
think that
Oh
in
man.
in saying that, it's like um, I feel like I'm liberal on some things and conservative on others, right? I'm a nerd, but I also do things that I think would surprise people, right? Like I'm into shooting and into guns and cars
You
and
break
working on
dance.
shit myself. Yeah, right. Um, but on the other hand, it's like I know that there are ways in which I'm painfully stereotypical, right? Like living in San Francisco, driving a Tesla in my like Patagonia, wearing Allbirds with my Apple Watch. Like
I
that
don't even know
is
what all birds is. That's
they're like the shoes that they're like these wool shoes that are just super
oh
comfortable.
yes. Okay. Okay.
Um, so in some ways it's like, oh yeah, there's nobody like me. But then on the other way, it's like there's 700 of me down the street right now,
Right.
and then you kind of go down the rabbit hole of like, well, then did we all arrive at that same sort of conclusion of like the uniform and the car because we're just unoriginal and terrible, or is it like did our environment sort of force us into that, right? Like for each one of those decisions, it's like the car. I've got a shitty commute, and I don't want to deal with the hour of stop and go, and I want to get in the carpool lane, and I want the car to drive itself. There's only really one car that does that well. Okay, I'll get the Tesla. And like Patagonia, like it's fucking San Francisco. There's like a 60-degree temperature
Mhm.
differential. If you want a jacket that'll like cram into your bag and small, Patagonia makes the best ones. If you need shoes that like you can walk into a meeting with, but also like walk 6 miles if and when you decide to, like Allbirds are good for that. So it's like it's like the environment of this city and in the tech industry and all these things that sort of like, yeah, there's a lot of people that are drawing that exact same conclusion, and it's a stereotype, but it's a stereotype for a reason. And um, does that define me? No, I don't think it does. But then I imagine again, all the other people wearing the exact same shit, doing the exact same thing, think that it doesn't define them either.
Sure.
So there's sort of like a conflict and irony there.
How do you feel about if people don't identify you, if their idea of your identity is different from your idea of your identity?
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, of course it is. How do you feel about it? Like, does it, some people may be bothered by that. They may want someone to acknowledge what they are, who they are, what they think. They hold it. They want to, I don't know, they'll get involved in like arguments about it.
In
It's like,
terms of like
from,
a positive thing, like I want you to recognize that I'm as accomplished as I am, or that like I am as smart as I, or just generally I want your perception of me to align with my perception of me.
I guess both, depending on where you're at, right? Like if you're on the playground, if you're a kid and like you play soccer, that's what I played. If you play soccer and then this person's like, oh, you're a terrible soccer player, or like you're bad, and like in your own head you thought you were good, and you may be like, oh, I need to prove myself. I'm not bad. I'm not bad at this. I'm good at this. Like they've spotted you as like non-athletic, bad soccer guy, and like suddenly you have to prove it to them. Obviously, that's an elementary example, but hey, I think of myself as whatever this subcategory of this type of psychotherapist, and someone's like, oh no, you're not. You're not there yet, or that category is not whatever. It doesn't hold value or whatever it is, right? Like, does that affect you? Do you feel harmed by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as much as I want to think that it doesn't bother me, or that I don't care what people think, there are a million examples where it's like I see it affecting how I am and how I behave. I'm trying to think of an example, or even one where I'm like projecting that, where like driving. it's like it's taken me a long time to get good at driving a car fast on a track. And if I
You
feel
got a
like,
Tesla to let it do it for. No,
right, right. No, but
sorry.
like, with the like, when I didn't have the Tesla, um, be like getting to that level and then seeing other people who are like worse at it, sort of passing judgment on people.
Sure.
Um, I start to sort of get into that mode where it's like, you don't know what you're talking about. Just stop, And it's like, who fucking cares? Like, let them go crash their car, not knowing what they're doing, or give people bad advice, or like mod their car out because they think it's gonna improve things for them. Even though I may know better, and even though that might be something that I see as sort of objective, the fact that we don't see eye to eye on that might bother me. And I mean, that's a really superficial, stupid example, but I think it's that kind of thing over and over and over. And I don't think anything, I mean, as with everything in life, I don't think anything is that polarized. I think there are things where I just genuinely don't give a fuck what people think. And then there are other times where I definitely do. And it definitely affects the way that I conduct myself.
Perhaps it's like some of the areas where we haven't entirely internalized that that's who we are. Like we want to move towards that direction. I don't know, whatever. We idealize something that we would like to identify with, but we don't entirely feel like we're part of it. Maybe because I've had similar instances, where it's like if someone identifies something incorrectly, sometimes I feel like I have to prove myself, right? In the grand scheme, what does it matter, right?
Right.
Nobody cares. Nobody's watching. Nobody's keeping a record on me. But internally, it's like I feel this thing of like I have to show you. I have to show you that I am this thing, right? And yeah, but perhaps for some of those things, it's like areas that I don't entirely feel are part of me, right? Even if perhaps in that one, those are some areas where some others may um, identify me as having those qualities that I internally feel insecure about. And then if someone else points it out that I don't have those qualities or I don't meet that label, then that would make me uncomfortable. I remember, speaking to psychotherapy or psychology, right? So like the big joke, right, is like, therapists are quacks, right? Um, Now, if you tell me that, like, I don't, whatever you're talking about doesn't make sense or it doesn't, you're not really helping out, that doesn't bother me anymore. I almost say like, yeah, hey, maybe I am a quack. I don't know. The more I know about it, the less I know about it, right? Is how I feel about it. But earlier on, like right when I was beginning things, if you tried to delegitimize what I was doing, I would have to defend it. And I
Right.
think it was because I felt so insecure about what I was doing. It's like, no, I needed to be around groups of people that had the same mindset, that felt very strongly about what I was doing. They also, we all drank the same Kool-Aid, so to speak, right? And because we drank the same Kool-Aid, we were untouchable because we stayed in the same little bubble, right? And it gave us a sense of confidence. Or for me, I'm speaking on these
No, but
whatever.
yeah, that's interesting, right? Because it's like like in terms of the maybe this is a good time to get into like sort of the benefits and the limitations of putting yourself in an affinity group or like identifying yourself with something.
Sure.
Like in terms of the benefits, it's like okay, you find other like-minded people. Which I mean, generally, that's sort of a fundamental question I have is like why do we always do that, right? Like
Right.
staying on the car topic, it's like I just want to go to Cars and Coffee and talk to other people about cars. And it's like, really, who gives a fuck? Like, it's almost
Right.
like, what are you going to, like, you're not going to break any ground there. You're all going to be like, oh, look at this car. It's so
Right.
sick.
Right.
Like,
Right.
no one's like challenging your view other than
Sure.
like nuances of it.
Sure.
Um, but then in terms of like professional or schooling or whatever, is it like, is it a benefit because it speeds up your next steps because it provides a more clear path forward, right? Like if we're all on the same page in terms of like that, this is a value being, in school for psychotherapy, I can watch somebody who's a year or two ahead of me and I can track their progress and see what they've done and the decisions that they've made that worked out and the decisions that they've made that didn't, and sort of inform my path forward based on that. So, I mean, there are ways in which I think that makes like that is one of the very clear benefits of putting yourself in that group, or if it's a political group or if it's a social group, like understanding what other people are going through, even if it's a negative thing, right? Like even if you identify as gay and being friends with other people who are gay to understand how they're struggling with something and how to sort of cope with it, um, that's very beneficial. But then I also see there's a lot of negatives, right? So you're polarizing yourself. You're putting yourself in a
Sure.
box with a group of people, and that has a positive, but then as a negative, you're sort of alienating yourself from others, right? And like we're seeing that politically, where despite, and maybe we'll get into this in another episode later, but like despite the fact that politically, I think we all lay on a spectrum somewhere, we are
Sure.
forced, at least in this country, to say it's either A or B.
Right.
It's north or south. It's like one or zero. That's it.
Right.
But that's not how life works, and I think that that is a huge negative, right? Like choosing to say I'm Republican or I'm Democrat right off the bat, you've just alienated 50% of the country,
Sure.
and that's a huge negative.
Right. I think too. There's I guess depending on like I don't know how evolved you are, how enlightened. That sounds so arrogant. How enlightened you are. I don't know if I am at all, but um, there is a piece where like you're suggesting there is a limitation, right? So I'm group A, yeah. So if I'm group A, I'm not group B if it's a dichotomous situation, or I'm not whatever the hell else is on the spectrum, yeah. So feeling, there's a feeling of as you get further along in it, as you feel more comfortable with whatever you've decided, you're okay with the consequence of not being B, right? You can see group B or all the other groups, and you can feel like, oh yeah, there's definitely a consequence to being A, but I'm making the decision and I'm accepting the consequence of being A, right? But then there's like a whole other, let's say, perspective that perhaps comes from, again, this sounds arrogant, but my thoughts on it are, it may come from a group of people that aren't entirely secure or aren't entirely evolved or enlightened or experienced, perhaps, or like don't have wisdom. I don't know, enough wisdom. Maybe they're still idealistic about their group or their team that they've chosen, where they don't want to accept, the limitations. Well, like I'm A and B exists, and B should think like A thinks, or the whole spectrum should think like A, and I need you to think that way, and I'm going to defend it. And if you have a question about, me being on A, I really, I'm going to attack you. I'm going to come after you, and I need you to see it like A. Versus, like recognizing that there is a limitation. Like, hey, I'm A. Here's a limitation to A. There's B over there. They have a perspective. There's the whole other spectrum. They have a perspective, and I'm okay with it. I'm okay that someone else has that sort of perspective. But I do think, like the limitation. Sometimes it limits your growth. You know what I mean? Like it surrounds you, and it may limit your, like your, I don't know, like your personal evolution, right? If you're always surrounding yourself that way, and if you're never willing to take the consequence of the thing that you've identified with.
Well, yeah, and I guess that's an interesting point too, where it's like some things I can say that I see the other side. I understand the argument. You can make a compelling case, and I can say, like, I get why you think that. I don't think that, and I'm probably not going to change my mind. But there's enough sort of subjectivity that I understand where you're coming from. Then there are other things where it's like, there's really not, right? And it's really hard to have a conversation with somebody who's like, well, global warming is a liberal conspiracy. And it's like, well, there's a fair amount of science behind it. And it's like, okay, then, but then I guess you could still break it down and say, like, am I a fucking scientist? Did I verify any of the facts? Like, I'm just still getting it from everybody else, or, in the same way that everybody else is getting their information. Basically,
I guess I'm thinking, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Just like somebody else has told me the raw facts, and scientists have sort of derived a conclusion that's like, this is not something that's part of a normal cycle like this. There's cause for panic, and we should be doing something about it soon. Like, but did I like take core samples out of the ice in Antarctica and like verify it myself? Like, no. So I guess objectively, you could still make some case there, but it's like, Jesus Christ, like this is one where that's where I can start, like, because it's something that's so important and should be so objective. That's why I understand why people get in arguments over that. But like ice cream flavors, that's very subjective. Like, sure, there is no right or wrong there.
Yeah, like someone's psychology or experience, that's whatever their life experiences that are causing them to not be able to see things objectively. Like that's like a whole weird thing, right? So like if I grew up in this group, and they've had this belief, then I can't, I can't, you have to be the enemy. And no, I can't, even if you have information that's accurate, I have to bend my mind. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if you have very objective information, very valid objective information, I have to bend my mind so that I continue to stay on my team. Because if I listen to some of your information, or I buy into some of your information, I'm afraid of alienation from this team that I thought I was part of, that maybe I didn't even pick. I just feel like they absorbed me, or I was brought into it, or whatever. I was surrounded by it. And if I leave, like, I'm off here by myself. You have like some sort of existential crisis of like, who am I? Where am I going? I'm going to get kicked out of the group. You don't feel strong enough. So yeah, it's weird, man. It's like some people have them because they're afraid to leave them. Like, some people's identities are based on just where they were at that time, and they need to be part of that, and they can't listen to your objective information about global warming, because it would make them different from this thing that they identify with, that they have to hold on to. And it's weird, because if you're having a conversation with someone like that, we don't always have the time to sit down and have a long, like, oh, I'm going to get to know you and I'm going to empathize with your position. You know what I mean? And I don't know, we'll make a connection somehow, and then you'll be able to get that information. Maybe in those situations, that's when we get up in arms, and that's when we don't get to know someone enough, and then we don't empathize with their situation, and therefore it like further strengthens their identity, even if it's not objective. You know what I mean? If it's not something that is objective.
Well, and I think, again, this is a whole other topic for a whole other day, but I think, again, I think what we're seeing a lot of, that polarization happening, not only politically, just with this last election and the way that it has divided people, but the spread of information or even misinformation through the internet, right? Like, before, you could be a Nazi in like, what, I'm not going to single out a state where Nazis might be from, but like you could be in your little town and have that opinion, and maybe you find a couple other assholes to like sort of go on a march with you or whatever. But now you can go to like the Nazi forums and find other assholes to pair up with and spread your bullshit more broadly, right? And like, that's the case of a very negative thing, and there are cases of obviously like positive, like, people like indirectly, I know you because of the internet, right? Because I like met some car people a million years ago that lived like a few towns over, and we became good friends, and then like I ended up working with one of them, and then like that's how I met you. So like it's connecting people in positive ways, but it's also connecting people with shitty ideas and making it much more of a valid idea, because they see strength in it, right? Like, before, I was a black sheep. Now I can go find a bunch of other people that like collect pogs or something. You know what I mean? Like, there's something for everybody now. And it's like,
bringing it back.
Right, slammers.
I collected. Sure. Yeah, so it's like, what are they really searching for then? Yeah, they're just searching for connection. So like, our identity is just so that we can feel connected to something, to like something greater, something important. So if you could intercept at a critical moment that person that's like has whatever destructive, shitty ideas, that they're trying to find a group that they belong to, right? I don't know, what, did they have like some hurt in them somewhere? Did they feel slighted somewhere, and they're looking for a group somewhere to connect to because they feel like no one else understands it? And if you could intercept somewhere in their trajectory at some critical moment, would it be possible that you can create some sort of connection with them that then, what perhaps changes later how they identify, which may change how they behave or something? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's to sort of the core question, which is like, how do you arrive at these identities? Yeah. Like, what caused it?
Sure.
And the question of like nature versus nurture, and if anybody is truly evil, or if we're all just sort of the subject of our environment, right? I don't. Sure. It's hard to imagine like sticking with the Nazi example, like what led to somebody being a terrible piece of shit. But, and I'm not going to like apologize for them, but like, surely something horrible happened to that person. It's not like they had like this really happy childhood, sure, and they were like, you know what, one day I just woke up and decided to be an asshole. I don't, maybe, I don't know any, but like, it's obviously not not a normal thing. And I think you can say that with a lot of things. I mean, some of these are very subjective, right? Like, are very, very objective. Like again, you being a psychotherapist, like we understand how you got there, we understand why you identify that way, but like your preference for BMW or your affinity for Pogs, like we don't know what.
I mean, I feel like I have some idea about that, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to think about why. You know, even like you mentioned, we understand why for psychotherapy. I feel like for that one, it's not so cut. It's not so.
Well,
cut
I
and
just
dry.
mean why today you identify, because that's your occupation, right? Like but in terms of the trigger that led to you going down that path, maybe we can't trace it back.
Right. I feel like I can, and it's not related to even being interested in doing that at all. It was like in some ways, you know, like kind of just tumbling through things, finding like various points that felt like they gave me some sort of footing, finding some figures within that area that I don't know. Maybe it felt like for me personally, whatever I could dive in is whatever. It'd probably be boring to dive really deep into it, but finding certain figures that, you know, felt like, hey, cool, man, you're okay at this. You belong here. And some part of it's like, huh, do I even, could I have done something else? Or did I do this because I was good enough? And then there was people in it that were like, hey man, you're good enough. Come be part of us. And then it's like, oh, cool. That's why I have that. Right. Like, that's why I have that. Or like, I decided that those people had some sort of value. I thought they were cool, whatever it was. I thought they were smart or whatever. And then I was like, oh yeah, but they like me. So here's the group that decided I was cool or smart enough. So I'm going to go hang out with them because it validates my thing. So like, you know, further down the trajectory, this is what I do as a job. Or like, the car preferences. I know I joke with you and I try to be objective, like the car thing, like why be, you know, I always have this justification. They make the best motors. They're the best performing, blah, blah, blah in their class. But really like the reason why I have a justification for that is when I really think back, there's always been an insecurity of being like some sort of immigrant and seeing from whatever my perspective was at the time, that's obviously seemed to have stuck. Like these good whites Americans. By the way, I'm Caucasian. If there's ever from Eastern Europe, so but these good American, like, you know, they're smart and they're good and they're white and they drive BMWs. I think is like where it is. So and on some level, man, it's like it's there, and it's like now I recognize that like I don't know who gives a shit, but like there's still some childish part of me that's like always trying to be satisfied. I'm like, yep, I'm part of the club now. I did it. I made it, man. I made it. I bought this 20-year-old this thing that's so old or whatever. But yeah, it's weird because there's many parts of that. Like that's the less critical mass, right? It's obviously just some bullshit hobby that.
But then, okay, I mean, we're going to scare everybody away by talking about cars too much. But like sticking with that example though, or anything like if it was not even necessarily yours, but like flashy watches or whatever, and it's like I recognize now that like I got into, I think, watches to some extent. It was that same thing. It was like, oh, that was like a success metric, right? Like you could get the Rolexes I always saw as douchey, which is actually funny because now I really like them, and not because they're like this success symbol, but more because now I understand and now I'm into watches for me. Like I like the craftsmanship and I like right. Or I've just become the douchebag that I feared. No, but you know what I mean? Where it's like, despite recognizing how I got into it or understanding like why most people are into like, oh, you've got a Rolex, cool, and that's the last thing I want when I'm wearing one.
Yeah,
it's like my perception of it's changed, but the outcome is still the same, right? It's still like I want that, and
sure.
And that's weird, right? And do you think that most people have that conclusion? Like, are most people self-aware enough to understand, or even are they doing it for themselves, or are they just doing it to be a part of that identity?
Yeah, it's you know, here's, I guess this is somewhat parallel, but okay, so people often come to the office, whatever you want to call it, like come to see me. Some of them may have ideas of what their diagnosis is, right? And I'm not a big fan of psychological diagnosis in general, but that's a whole huge discussion that
because you don't want to put people into you don't believe, as with everything we're talking about, that it's that, like, it is a defined
it's not cut and
thing.
dry. It's not
right.
objective.
We can't put you into a box like you have pieces of this, pieces of that.
Right.
But, okay.
So I'll give a little piece of it, I guess. Amongst the diagnoses, right? There's a book. It's called the DSM, a Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. Whatever. That's where all the diagnoses are contained. And there's in statistics, I don't know, people that are familiar with stats, there's a thing called inter-rater reliability, right? So who's measuring it and how consistent can they be with measuring it? Does Jordan see A? Does Mike see A? Does Bob see A? Does Steve see A? Right? It's so the reliability amongst the different raters is so low that it suggests to me that, okay, these things are not valid, right? Whatever. But that's another topic. But it seems like within that, though, people are interested in, like, hey, I have this affliction, right? Or like, this is it. And I talked to this support group about this affliction. And it's like, well, what's the benefit of that one, right? Because, like, this one is not, it's how you're being gratified with it is not as overt as, like, hey, I achieved and I bought a Rolex, right? I was able to get a Rolex, and this is like I'm interested in it now because I understand parts about it, or at least I justify that. Or people recognize that this is an achievement, whatever. It doesn't matter. But yeah, this is a different one, right? Because, like, people, hey, I have bipolar, or I have ADHD. And now there's specific phobia, the internet, man, the internet. I can't even think of what they are, but they're so specific.
Oh, like tryptophobia is one. Have you?
To be honest with you, this might sound. I don't even know what those are, because I don't really pay attention to them, because I feel like you'll come in my office, I'll talk with you, I'll get an understanding of what ails you based on your description. But no, I don't pay attention to all these labels. It's
I think there's. Yeah. I don't want to derail it too much, but I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I feel like that's another way in which the internet has provided people with crutches for everything now. Like you can,
but maybe that's it. Maybe that there is a part of identity where it's like, okay, I identify with this thing. There are the overt parts that everyone understands, and then maybe there are these covert signals that I'm trying to send. Like I'm getting, I don't know, I have this affliction or that thing. And maybe then, there's some underlying or whatever, a covert way of being gratified. You will forgive me for this, or I don't have to be accountable for that thing, or you'll care for me in this certain way. So yeah.
I guess I'm thinking more, and there's certainly people who struggle with depression or struggle with anxiety and have to deal with that. And it's something that, that is a real issue. But there are also, I think, the internet has given everybody a means to connect and to understand what other people are going through, and to like amplify what I think are probably in most cases like minor afflictions, and lean on it and use it as a means of like not being a normal functioning member of society anymore, right? Like people do have paralyzing anxiety. I don't doubt that. But now it's sort of like, it's become like a caricature of what it once was. And now, just because like I don't like standing up and speaking to a group of 100 people, I can be like, oh my God, I have anxiety. And it's like, well, nobody, I mean, very few people are comfortable with getting up and doing that, right? Like very few people are want to be on TV or want to be an actor and can deal with the pressure to perform. But like some of the people that I know that actually do that for a living have terrible anxiety. Like they don't want to be doing it, but they don't want to be, they have the anxiety. They don't want to have to be performing like that, but they love the job so much, and they love sort of the output that it's like they just power through it. And I think that's part of the way that the world's changing, is like before you deal with that, right? Like I have a lot of that. There are little things that bother me, and there are things that I'm very, very uncomfortable with. But I try to resist the urge to identify with that group of people, because I think then it's a limitation, right? And
right.
It's not to say everybody's doing that. I mean, and there are for every example of somebody who is sort of falsely putting themselves in that bucket, there are people who are like powering through some sort of actual legitimate disability and overcoming it, and it's inspirational. But it's like, I think that is another way in which I see the internet has being very divisive, because it's giving people who don't really have a serious problem a means of just sort of like getting out of responsibility or devolving, you know?
Sure. Well, I mean, in that situation, I guess, okay, so if I can weave a common thread here, perhaps identity serves to connect people with the consequence of, if you get overly invested in it, disconnects you from other people. And perhaps in some of those cases, some people don't like the feeling that someone would decide to be disconnected from them, or whatever, would like to be whatever. They don't like the consequence of the disconnect. But like with there on the internet, those people found a group that, I don't know, perhaps didn't want to be, let's say, just for example, accountable for something. So they found a group who contained a similar affliction. They felt like those people could empathize with them, but then they also felt like they were part of something, right? That in some situations there's well, maybe in that situation there's a lot of consequence to doing that, right? Of the person not taking accountability, but because there's a group with them, they feel connected, and maybe then they'll be stuck in their little, whatever, their thought bubble forever with this think tank of other people that have similar perspectives, and it doesn't allow them to evolve. But yeah, it seems like maybe the thing that we're looking for when we do this is like a way to connect, or a way to feel part of something bigger. And if we can't find a way to do it that, I don't want to say has merit, because I almost feel like that's subjective, but whatever, a way that's more widely recognized as being a merit, perhaps you'll identify with something that, I don't know, what's the opposite of a merit? I don't know. Whatever. It is some sort of negative identifier, or some sort of affliction, or some sort of diagnosis, or some sort of whatever to use to connect. Yeah, but then it's like, it's difficult to accept the consequence of that.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I think...
what are your hard identities, man? Oh, so finish your smart person thought, and then let's talk dumb after.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's like, I think spelling out the way that people perceive themselves inwardly versus like project themselves outwardly, and sort of the way that I identify versus how I think you'd identify me, is an interesting dichotomy. But
yeah,
it's like, I would hate even telling you what I think I am. You know what I mean? Like, it could.
Of course.
You go first.
Of my stupid
No,
ones?
just like, whatever. I don't know. Whatever. Because to me, it's like an inverted pyramid, right? It's like, what do you first and foremost identify as? And then like the next level down is sort of like layers of other shit, right? Like, so the biggest one is broad and at the top, and then you just sort of get more narrow and more narrow, or like, at least the top, there becomes more of them, but they're smaller. Like, at the bottom, it would be like, I'm a cat owner and like, I like the color blue, but that doesn't define me. Whereas like at the top, it would be, man, like working in tech, like into cars, that kind of shit. Like,
that's interesting. You identify. That's funny. I know that was just your example. You just threw it out there. You identify with man. I don't even think about that.
No, that's interesting. I guess I don't. I mean, that's different than a sort of categorization, right? I guess I don't identify, because I don't see myself as being like, beef jerky and explosions and trucks. I like, that's not a part.
Come on.
Even though I just rented a Raptor like 3 days ago, but
yeah, I guess. Okay, so I have the things that bear in mind, I'm aware of how ridiculous some of these are, but we have to have something here, and I haven't found anything better yet. I haven't found a more evolved version of myself yet, so this is what I'm holding on to keep myself together here now. So if anyone ever listens to this, don't be too critical of this, please. Or do whatever you want. It's really, I'll figure it out.
What if they identify as a critic?
Then they have a pass, man. They've identified as a critic. Don't criticize the critic. It's their job. It's not fair.
No, I'm saying then you have to let them criticize you, because
yeah, that's what I mean. I'm saying as the critic, though, isn't it like somewhat an unfair shield? Like, hey, man, I'm a critic. I say these things. Don't be upset that I said
Right.
them. It was
No offense, but
yeah. What?
this is something that's
Yeah.
super offensive.
No.
Yeah. No, that's what I mean. Like when people
Oh yeah,
criticize
yeah,
you,
yeah.
but they're like, they can just
Right,
preface it with no offense, and then you're supposed to not take offense.
right, right, right. Oh, don't be
But
offended. This is the worst
hate your
performance I've
outfit.
ever
Yeah.
seen in my life. I'm just being, helping you out. It's my job. No, what do I identify with? I don't know. I think when I walk into a room, love it or hate it or whatever someone else thinks about, I have a certain look that I like to have, and I like to feel like I'm potent, whatever that means. And how I look, I like to think like, oh, I demonstrate potency just based on how I look because I exercise, or I whatever, I wear clothes that are tailored, that emphasize pieces that I think are potent, right? I don't, not in some seductive way, but it's like, okay, this person looks strong. Whether or not that's really me, I don't know. I guess I feel like that. So there's that part on the furthest exterior. I like to internally, identify as like, okay, a person that, whatever this means, is smart or has good ideas. With someone that's funny, I think I'm funny. That's definitely something I would identify with. Like if like comedy, I don't know if that ever comes across on here, but in my head,
No, it's never come across that way.
in my head, that's what it feels like. Sometimes, like I guess is a problem solver. I'm into cars. I have a specific set of cars that I'm interested in. Again, just going back to wanted to be the whites when I was a young man, and those were the ones that felt like they could be in striking distance. And turns out some of them were pretty decent too. So that's where I am with that. I don't think I identify much with an ethnicity, which I know is often a big, and maybe to some, well, not maybe. There's definitely part to me that counter identifies with my ethnicity, just because I felt uncomfortable with it. Because it was like a little country, and the people I was around, like some of the family members that I've been around, didn't assimilate, and it felt like, why can't they fit in, right? So I felt uncomfortable with them not being able to assimilate. So there was some part of it that's a counter identification. Maybe that's why I don't pay attention to that now. It's like I gave it up, and then I don't know, I never paid attention. I don't identify with a religion, really. I don't identify with it. Not that I'm obviously aware that I'm a man, but I don't think I think through that. I don't know. That's where I'm at with that.
That's,
what about you?
Jesus. Okay. I feel like
I don't identify with a job either, actually, strangely.
Really?
I don't. Yeah, at all. Zero. I forget. Like if someone if you're like, hey, what do you do? And I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I've been doing this forever.
Well, but you brought up a few times earlier that you identify as a psychotherapist.
I was literally just using a label that came to mind as it was an easy.
So you don't like that hat isn't always on. You're not always analyzing people
in the world.
Really?
No, it feels strange. If I walk into the building and I'm supposed, maybe that's part of it where you were talking about earlier, where it's like a part that turns off or on. I think of someone that thinks, I don't know, perhaps in a certain way that someone is psychologically inclined or psychologically minded or whatever would think. But yeah, I don't know. There's a part of that where it's like, I don't think about that until I'm in the room. If there's a bunch of, I don't know, professionals or whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, this is what I do. Oh yeah, this is what I do. So it gives some idea or some credential. But yeah, I guess I don't think about that for myself when I'm out and about. I'm just like some dude.
It's funny for me. It's like
I'm some dude with tight clothes.
I guess it's weird because that's one way. Like I mentioned that as sort of being like at the top of ways that I identify, but it's like how I identify myself in terms of like a group that I put myself in. But if somebody asks me what I do, I hate talking about it and I hate trying to explain it. And because I don't.
I still don't know what you do,
exactly.
By the way.
And it's just like, what's even the point of like worrying about, because it doesn't matter, right? Like it's like I can just tell you some of the shit that I work on or something, or like the output, right. But unless you're interested in it, because that's one thing I identify myself. A big part of what makes me, and this might be a bad thing, but I see it as a good thing in most cases, is that I hate inefficiency. And because of that, I rarely talk about myself to people. Like if we met and you're like, what do you do? I'll give you like the 2-sentence rundown of it. If that, maybe 1 sentence. I'll be like, oh, I do this. And then if you ask for additional context or something, I'll provide a little bit more. And then if we get in a conversation, then that's fine. And then like once you've opened the door, I'm fine with it. But I don't like one of my biggest pet peeves in life is like somebody who just fucking, as we're talking for an hour about this shit, I hate people who talk for too long about something that I just don't give a fuck about.
You came here.
Right. So leave. Our 1 subscriber left. Yeah, I mean, it's just so I think like, yeah, as I identify myself as efficient, that is like at the core of my being. And because of that, I'm short with people, and it's not like a rude thing. It's like, and it's funny because it might come off that way, but it's like I value your time maybe even more than you do.
It's very Asian.
Right. But I value my time also, and I don't want to like spend time telling you about something that you don't want to hear about, especially if it's wasting my time too. Like that sounds bad, but you know what I mean? And that's why, you know, I work hard, not long. Like I try to like get in, do my shit, get out, drive fast home, and like clean my house for 7 hours. But yeah, other sort of core identifiers.
You're just efficient.
Efficient.
That's it.
That's it. Like, and nothing else in life. Like,
hey, I'm Jordan. I'm efficient.
Right. That's it.
No,
efficient. That's
everything you can derive from that. That's
right. Imagine whatever you think that is, but it would be inefficient for me to fill in any of the other blanks. Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's funny. I said male earlier, but now I guess that I think about it, no. In fact, there are a lot of ways in which I don't think I identify with either side. I just sort of am. Like, not asexual is too strong of a term, but like I don't think that I define myself by my sexual orientation or like sort of fitting into a bunch of boxes. But a lot of the shit I do, I guess, is like more homosexual. Right. A lot of the things I guess that I do, as with everything else, can sort of be stereotyped. Like there are a lot of things that I do that are like, oh yeah, that's like dumb, like shit men would do, you know, like maybe not so much anymore, but like a few years ago, like things that I would do with friends or whatever. And it's like, Jesus Christ, like, yeah, a man, like only a man would ever like intentionally hurt themselves by doing stupid shit like that. But
I think of that as like we're boys trying to be men. Yeah, because we have the wrong idea. But
well, that's funny then, because then it's like, okay, now are we men because we don't feel like we have to do that anymore? So do we identify more as men than we ever did before, even though we're not outwardly doing stupid shit?
It's just private.
Right. Other identifiers.
Bro, I just have that you're efficient.
Right. That's like all I needed to tell you, though. I mean, like,
that's it.
I think
efficient Jordan.
I want to, in terms of like things that I want, you mentioned like walking into a room and wanting to seem potent. I want to walk into a room and have people recognize my strengths, and the most important one, I think, being intelligence. Like I give less of a shit, obviously, about what I'm wearing and more about what you think of me, like intellectually, which is hard.
That's tough. You got to have an opportunity to demonstrate that.
And when you're asking me what I do and I'm like not telling you, obviously that's not coming across, but I think, and and that's in cases where like the door has been open, right? Like at work, where the door is always open because like you're contributing. I'm trying to like only provide the information that I think people need to make good decisions. Like I was saying an example about like interacting with the boss. So it's important to me though that people don't think that I'm stupid or that I'm like making the wrong decision, right? Like that, and that's a core thing about me that I would say I like at the top layer.
You want to not be stupid.
I know that I'm not stupid. I want
Okay.
people to understand like where I'm coming from,
Sure.
that like my decisions are rooted like in objectivity and that they're informed.
Sure.
Like if I'm not telling you, it's because I don't think it's pertinent. And if I am telling you, it's not like a feeling. It's not like I licked my finger and
Sure.
held it up to the wind. It's like based on experience or like data, right? Like that is an important part of what makes me me.
So your outputs too are then very efficient. If you ask, that's what you really want. If you didn't ask, that's not what you want to
Right.
do. If I say, "Do you want to go eat ice cream?" and you didn't ask me,
Well, okay. I mean,
because
I'm
you're
not an
reading a
asshole.
book.
Like, but
Okay, but like, no, I know. But like, if you're reading a book and I'm like, "Hey, do you want to play ping pong?" It's kind of like, no, I'm reading a book right now. That's why I chose to read a book.
I don't know if I follow your
I don't
example.
I don't know. I was just riffing here.
It's just
Off
more,
of, like,
yeah,
what
like,
I was projecting on your,
and I think that's
your
why, like,
efficiency.
as with all this stuff, like, I sort of struggle with the people who are just forcing themselves into these groups and stuff because I don't like nothing's that polarized, right? Like, and that, I guess that's kind of the conclusion of this whole thing, which is like, I think it's important to identify in some cases. I think there are huge negatives to identify in other ways. It's a part of like human nature, right? I mean, I think that like finding a
Sure.
commonality and finding a means of sort of putting yourself with others is a very crucial thing that makes us human, but also um, it can make you inhuman. It can sort of amplify something that might have been a small sort of who am I to say negative, but a negative personality trait or viewpoint or political alignment, whatever it is, and it can give you a soundboard to let that snowball into something that's should never have gotten to that point. And so I don't know what the conclusion is. I mean, I think it's important that we all continue to like sort of put ourselves in these boxes, but there are certainly cases where it's not a good thing.
Yeah. So recognize the limits, perhaps. Recognize the limits of putting yourself into a box. Accept the limit of putting yourself into a box. Maybe try not to be. I guess you could be disappointed if someone doesn't like the box that you're in, but try to just be accepting of it and try to be accepting of their box, because we all need them, better or worse, and like we're all using them to connect, and we're all hoping, I would imagine, good ones or bad ones, that they're going to be moving us forward. So yeah, maybe that's the conclusion. The conclusion is we use identity to connect us at different stages of our lives. We may be uncomfortable with the disconnect that identity provides, or we may not recognize it, but later on know that it's a part of you. I don't know, be perhaps proud if it's part of you, but also if it's, whatever, if someone disagrees with it, if it comes with consequence, you have to accept that, and it's okay. It'll be all right. If someone disagrees with it, it's no problem. And you don't have to get mad at them if they disagree with it. You can still recognize theirs and that they have limits too.
Agreed.
Word.
Good job. That was a very efficient wrap up.
Perfect.
And you know how I am.
Cool.
All right.
All right. Yeah.
Good chat.